Okay, I think that's my signal. We can get started. So welcome everyone to our speaker series program, the National Capital Area Chapter, Depression and Bipolar Support Alliance. DBSA is an organization providing peer support, education, advocacy for people with depression or bipolar. And we're very pleased you joined us tonight for this speaker program. I'll note again, this is being recorded. If you don't want to be seen on the Zoom screen, turn off your camera and rename yourself. If you need any assistance, you can put a message to the host in the chat box. Everyone is muted at this time. You're invited to submit questions during the program in the chat box, and we will address as many as we can. Other upcoming events are chapter outreach project. We got a generous donation to support development of a community outreach program focusing on communities of color. And the special planning committee has been established. Its next meeting will be Tuesday, May 18th, 7:15. Everyone who may be interested, invited to participate, reach out to Greg Billings. There's his email address, billings.g@gmail.com. If you're interested. Also, we'll announce officially tonight our next speaker program. We're going to have our annual talk by our medical advisor, Dr. Frederick Jacobson. That will take place on Thursday night, Thursday, June 17th. It'll be at 6 p.m. Note the time. His title is COVID Sense and Sensibilities, the Tsunami of Depression/Anxiety, Sleep, and Public Stress Meet Research Advances and the Goal of Health Maintenance. A program like this will require advanced registration, and details on that will be coming. National DBSA and our chapter welcome contributions. There's the link for Donate to National. There's a donation link on our website. Email the chapter address. We're both 501c3 tax-exempt organizations. If you are not receiving our regular emails and want them, the way to do that now is to sign up at the link provided. You can find it from our website for the weekly newsletter. The previous email list has been retired, so you should need to opt into this. And a weekday update, well, it's at the link below. You can see on screen, and someone will post it, I think, in the chat box. Okay. Where are we? So we have various meetings which are currently all on Zoom, but these listings identify them by their former and probably future meeting location. Sign-on information is available on our website, on Meetup, and in the weekly email announcements. So I think there are 7 different groups of either peer support or family groups. Okay, and now I will turn this over to Eric, who will get to introduce our speakers tonight, Phyllis Foxworth and Roy Grinker. So Eric, take it away.
Thank you, Alvin. It's a great honor to first introduce Phyllis Foxworth, who I work with closely on a daily basis. She's the Advocacy Vice President of the National Depression and Bipolar Support Alliance. She has been diagnosed on her own with a mental health condition in early childhood, but continues to live in wellness and facilitates a weekly family and friend support group in the Chicago area. She has been directing the organization's national advocacy strategies with a focus on strengthening mental health parity laws, compliance, broadening the adoption of peer support services, and the development of peer specialist workforce, and ensuring the patient-desired treatment outcomes are adopted, integrated throughout the system. She's been doing this since about 2012. It's been a great honor to work with her. I'm very glad that she's going to be here today in conversation with Richard Grinker, who I have gotten to know over the last year. He is a professor of anthropology and international affairs right here in Washington at the George Washington University. He is the great-grandson, grandson, and father of psychoanalysts. We will hear more about. He graduated from Grinnell College in 1983 and has a Ph.D. in Social Anthropology from Harvard University in 1989. Author of a number of different books, both in the fields of anthropology, but also mental health and autism issues. Excited that he's received the National Alliance on Mental Illness and Ken Award for outstanding contributions to understanding mental illness. And in 2010, he was the recipient of the American Anthropology Association's Anthropology to Media Award for Communication of Anthropology to the general public to the media. So we're just really excited to have these two really great folks tonight and have a conversation about the book that Richard has just finished writing and put out to the public around the issues of stigma. So I'm going to now turn it over to Phyllis. Let me spotlight Phyllis and let's see, spotlight. Okay, I think you're good to go, Phyllis.
Well, thank you, Eric, for that warm introduction. Let me just start out by saying I'm honored to be here as a guest tonight of the DBSA National Capital Area Chapter as part of their speaker series. It's a great program that you have going, and glad and honored to be part of it. But as Eric said, I have the great privilege of interviewing anthropologist and author Richard Grinker. So I'm just going to say, while Richard is a fascinating person and author of several published works, it's my pleasure tonight to have a discussion with Richard on his most recent book, which is Nobody's Normal: How Culture Created the Stigma of Mental Health. And as Alvin said, we've built in ample time for questions tonight. So please go ahead and put your questions in the chat box, and we will get to those. So welcome, Richard. Thank you for tonight.
I'm thrilled.
So for those of you who haven't read the book, I just want to share with you that Richard's great-grandfather, his grandfather, and his father were all very well-known and respected psychiatrists who were on the cutting edge of the ideas around the evolution of psychiatry as a recognized science, the identification and classification of mental health disorders, and the treatment of those disorders. So let me just ask you first, Richard, what was it like growing up surrounded by members of psychiatric royalty?
Well, they wanted me to be a psychiatrist too. They wanted a dynasty, you know. They were in competition with other families that had multiple generations of mental health care specialists. And when I was 6 years old, my grandfather, I was a late reader and I couldn't even read what he wrote because I didn't know how to read full sentences. He gave me a copy of his book that was published that year in 1967. And he said, to my grandson who will carry on. And so there was all of this pressure. But what was particularly interesting was that even though I chose a different career, I had an education in psychiatry. And I had an education in psychiatry from people of different generations who had very different beliefs, but who all taught me the same thing, that mental illnesses had become a double illness. First, the condition itself, and then secondly, on top of that, society's negative judgment, shame, secrecy, discrimination. And regardless of some of their views, which were sometimes controversial, that was a consistent theme that ran through my family. And so it's no surprise that, you know, even as an anthropologist, I was able to look critically at my own culture to see how we in the United States or in Western Europe have created this idea that mental illnesses are somehow a sign of something bad, weakness, fragility, whatever it might be. And the goal of this book is to understand how that came about and what we can do to stay on what I consider to be a positive course. I think we're making a lot of progress in eliminating stigma.
Yes, thank you. And I said I found the book very captivating, and I found the history of just mental health and psychiatry to be particularly captivating. But you know, you kind of laid out the inspiration for the book. What was your journey around creating the narrative around this story? Not the story, but
you know, like anybody else who's ever written anything large, you start and you never know exactly how it's going to end up. I thought the book was going to be entirely about military psychiatry, because my grandfather was the head of psychiatric operations in North Africa during World War II. And that was where he really was a pioneer in shifting the science and the treatment of mental illness away from asylums and the most serious conditions into the general population and what we now consider to be sort of the common mental disorders, like anxiety disorders, depression. But it just expanded and it kept getting bigger and bigger. And if somebody said to me, hey, Professor Grinker, I'd really like to write a book where I do the whole history of the stigma of mental illness, plus military psychiatry, and it's going to be really international, and I'm going to weave into it my 4 generations of family history, I'd say, okay, good luck, choose a different topic. But somehow it ended up actually, becoming a coherent entity. And so the book's divided into 3 parts. The first part is a sort of a general history of how we came about this, creating the idea that there were distinctly mental illnesses apart from physical and other kinds of illnesses, and the stigma around it. And then the second part deals with how wars and other global stressors actually end up kind of jump-starting and leveraging movements to eradicate the stigma of mental illness. And then the third part is more general, but is very critical of the kind of single-minded biological turn recently, where a lot of the leaders in psychiatry have been focusing on the brain and brain disorders rather than looking at the relationship between the body and the mind, or looking at the relationship between the mind and the total context in which we live, whether it's COVID or poverty or the economy, whatever might be, traumatic childhood. I'm very critical of the kind of that singular focus. And so that's how the book's organized, in those 3 parts.
Yeah, and I really found that fascinating myself to capture each one of those segments and really dive into it. But I'm going to share that one of the main takeaways from reading the book was how normal is defined by societies in which we live. And so you write about examples of behaviors in non-Western cultures that have been conditioned to think of, that we've been in our Western culture, been conditioned to think of as abnormal, but other cultures see as normal behaviors to outside external forces. Can you share some of those thoughts with the group here?
Yeah, I like the way you phrased that. One of the best examples is how normalized gender fluidity is in many societies. I also give examples of places in which deafness is seen as a sort of normal part of human variation rather than a disability. What we see if we look across the globe is that people have a disability only when the environment that they live in makes it difficult for them to achieve what they want to achieve. So imagine that we all spoke sign language, everybody, we learned it just along with oral speech. We learned sign language. Deafness would no longer be a disability. If we had ramps and elevators and other sorts of things, being differently mobile wouldn't be a disability. And so we find that in a lot of other cultures, there are ways that people manage differences so that they are understandable and that they are expected or considered part of the human condition. Take, for example, hearing voices among certain peoples in Namibia that I lived with, hunter-gatherers in the Kalahari Desert, where they don't think it's good that somebody's hearing horrible voices in their head saying terrible things to them. That's real suffering. But they don't blame the human being themselves. They externalize it and they say, well, there's something that we as a society must have done wrong, or there's something that somebody else must have done wrong. And this person is more of a victim than somebody who has to be, totally responsible for their suffering. And so wherever we see society take some of the blame, we see stigma decrease.
That's very interesting. And that, that picks up on one of the themes that when I was reading that section of the book, I was really intrigued by the compassion that members of other, societies had towards individuals in those communities that might be experiencing those traumas. And, you described that quite well. And
Well,
I'm just
yeah.
going to say, yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think it has to do largely often with social supports
Yes.
that it's, I guess compassion is one way to think about it, but it's also an ideology that is different, right? I mean, we developed, and I go through this in Nobody's Normal, we developed this idea that the ideal human being is the individual autonomous person who's not dependent on anybody. But in most of the rest of the world, being dependent on others is considered to be the norm. We're all dependent. That is the human condition. We're a social animal. And so, when I asked a question of the parents of a little boy who's non-speaking and would likely be diagnosed with autism in the United States, who was going to take care of him when they died, they just didn't even understand my question. I said, well, when you die, who's going to take care of him? And they said, oh, you mean if everyone died? And I said, no, just you. And they kept saying, but we're not all going to die at once. And they just could not even conceive of it. And as the dad of a 29-year-old child, a young woman with autism, I've gotten asked that question her whole life. Will she be able to live independently? Will she be able to live independently? Well, the people that I lived with in Namibia would never even conjure up such a question.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And see, that support, I love how you put that it's that support system that society brings, that different societies bring to support the individual members of their society. And as I said, this book really was fascinating to me around a historical perspective, because I contrast that with the Western world's invention, let's say, of institutions to warehouse people that were experiencing less than optimal mental health, that was born out of capitalism in the 1700s. And that was just fascinating how capitalism really brought that into the mental asylums that we think of the 1700s into play. Why don't you share a little bit about that history?
Well, we may not worship multiple gods in most of our communities in the US, and we may not believe that all our suffering is caused by supernatural malevolence, but we do worship capitalism. We do worship productivity. We have built a shrine to almost infinite needs. And when the first asylums were created in Western Europe in the early 18th century, there were some before then, but they were really mostly prisons. Those asylums had as their mandate to house the people who were a drag on their family economy. And it wasn't police or governments who brought them in. It was family members who said, we're trying to produce surplus. We're trying to maximize our gains. And this person is not, pulling his weight. And so the first people who were diagnosed with mental illnesses, though the terms were things like insanity, idiocy, lunacy, were people who were failed workers. They had failed to achieve that ideal of autonomy. And even today, we often consider the most stigmatized conditions to be those that involve a lack of self-control or autonomy, like substance abuse or psychotic disorders.
Yeah, it's just fascinating for you to put it in that perspective, that it was based on, the amount of productivity that people have, and that's their value and contribution to society.
Well, and even today, we see in the definitions of mental health, in the World Health Organization, the United Nations, being independently productive. That's part of their definition of mental health. Well, what does that say about the person who is a stay-at-home parent? Are they disabled? Are they not mentally healthy? Or the person who, like my daughter, works but can't live on her own financially because she doesn't make enough money because she's in a low-paying job because she's autistic.
Right. Yeah, you touched on this earlier. I want to go back to it in your introduction about laying out the book, but you just touched on it. I was fascinated by how the war machine really played into the development of mental health conditions. And, you know, in the book, for me, it kind of started with World War I, that, you know, shell shock became diagnosed. And this was an integral first start around the development of classifications about mental health conditions. Is that right? Did I get that right?
No, you do have that right. But I mean, I think you can go back to the Civil War too, and the War of 1812. I mean, whatever war we're looking at, all of a sudden, doctors are encountering people who did not have a emotional suffering or emotional distress before, and then they did after they were exposed to trauma or the stresses or anxieties of war, or even imagining going into war. And it was in those contexts that we see the development of psychiatry as we know it. Military psychiatry is a very understudied, underappreciated discipline, in large part because it's uncomfortable to say that anything good comes out of a war, right? That's a tough thing to say, and it's not to justify wars, but it is that within wars, everybody is under stress. It's sort of like my grandfather said in World War II about the men that he treated who were pilots with severe anxiety disorders. He said, these are not abnormal men. These are normal men in abnormal circumstances. And when that kind of a global stressor, like a war, occurs, then mental suffering becomes expected, acceptable, reasonable. And we also feel that we have an obligation to take care of those people. And so what happens after World War II? Harry Truman says, wow, there were a lot more mental illnesses than we ever thought before. And that's largely because there were a lot more psychiatrists like my grandfather who were treating people and coming up with diagnoses and trying to come up with new therapies. And he says, well, we got to do something about this. And there were so many more mental illnesses in the war. And so he orders the military to adapt its manual of mental disorders for the civilian population. And that became the very first DSM. The DSM was originally an Army and Air Force manual. Because of the prevalence of mental illnesses during World War II, among soldiers who fought and those who didn't fight, Truman also founded the National Institute of Mental Health. And so you wonder, would this have occurred without that war? And so you look now at the COVID pandemic, which, you know, most world leaders liken to a war, and you wonder whether this is one of those opportunities or one of those invitations to say, hey, when you are under stress or when you are in a particular condition, pre-existing mental illnesses can get worse, and we can have new onset mental illnesses. And it's not a sign of weakness or fragility. It is because you're under stress. It's because you're in a particular kind of environment. And I think that, you know, if I tell you today that I've had a lot of anxiety and feelings of depression during the pandemic, I don't think anybody would say, ooh, something's wrong with him. You'd say, yeah, tell me about it. I have too, probably, you'll say.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So, you know, we've only just begun to touch a fraction of how societies in modern times have willingly or unwillingly influenced how we view mental health. For those of you who haven't read the book, read the book about, and I was just fascinated by the war machine and how the economics of war to make sure that we had warriors really, you know, in many ways defined that DSM. And so read that book, folks. It's fascinating. But, you know, we don't have time to go into all of them. So can you kind of share a little bit? One of the things, because I'm a woman, that I was particularly interested in was how feminism shaped our view of mental health.
Well, I think that's a particularly interesting story with regard to the development of a category of post-traumatic stress disorder for the general population, because war neurosis is the term that was used before PTSD, and war neurosis was for soldiers, right? and as after the Vietnam War, actually even during the Vietnam War, there were a lot of attempts by the psychiatric community to say, well, we need a Vietnam War syndrome because people are having these symptoms and they have them long after the war is over, long after they've come home. And it couldn't really gain traction because it was about a very specific part of the population. And feminist groups in particular, feminist groups of psychologists, psychiatrists, sociologists said, look, war does cause a lot of trauma, but so does domestic violence, so does rape, so do other kinds of things that that affect us. And I don't think PTSD would have ever been named as such or even gotten into the DSM had it not been for feminist advocates saying we need to understand the mental impact of terrible stress and trauma to people not just who are warriors or not who are in the military. I mean, that's an important story to tell.
Yeah.
Because things don't really end up happening much in the development of medicine, psychiatry, and science unless there's broad social support for it.
Right.
And
when you think back to the 60s and the evolution of feminism and women, and they're coming into their own and demanding more, it seems like a natural evolution there, and with mental health as well. But go ahead.
It just seems to me that that mental health advocacy was kind of a latecomer, and civil rights movements, gay, lesbian, LGBT, transgender movements, that they ended up. I'm sorry if there's a little noise in my house. There's a lot of family here, and I'm at home like everybody else, so I apologize if you hear some things in the background. But mental health advocacy really is something that I think is rather new in relationship to general human rights advocacy. I'm very, very positive about it, and have a lot to. I think that there's a lot of optimism.
Yeah. Well, as I said, I serve as the Vice President for Advocacy for DBSA, so I definitely echo those sentiments that. It's the next. I always call mental health as a civil rights advocacy movement, that it's about asserting our rights.
Right.
But as I read the book, it seemed to me that we just keep adding more and more classifications of mental health conditions, and I'm not sure if that's a good thing or not. I'm not going to weigh in on that. But in your book, what struck me was something you wrote in your book. Once a diagnosis becomes popular, the rate of other classifications plummet. What's the significance of that? Yeah,
so there are a couple of questions embedded in your single question.
Yeah.
One of which is how we tend to lump certain disorders or split, right? They're the lumpers and the splitters, or there are certain kinds of researchers who want to carve out their own disorder for their own fame and their own research. But generally, I think the most important point is that a diagnosis is only worth anything if it drives a treatment, if it helps somebody, right? So let's just take the diagnosis of autism. We used to have autism and Asperger's. And why did we come up with Asperger's? Not because there was some real condition that we could see under a microscope that was Asperger's, but because at the time, in the early 90s, late 80s and early 90s, autism was so stigmatized that advocates, parents, educators wanted a term for autism that did not signal the kind of severe disability that was associated with the way autism was defined at that time. For example, people with autism who were quite verbal and who were, going to college. But over time, we changed the term autism to be something that was much broader and certainly much less stigmatized. And then we didn't need Asperger's anymore. And so now they've gotten rid of Asperger's, not because anybody cured or eradicated Asperger's in the world, but because we didn't need that conceptual framework anymore. So what all of these diagnoses are that multiply in every DSM are just different conceptual frames that are presented in an effort to find out what works and what doesn't work. Now, if you look at the American public school system's records of providing special education between the years of 2001 and 2011, that decade, you find that the rate of autism classifications in the public schools increases by over 300%. Now, at the same time, you find that the rate of delivery of special education to children remained static. It didn't change. So the same percentage of kids, about 12%, were getting special education services when very few people were diagnosed with autism, as when there was a 300% increase. That doesn't seem to make sense, does it? We'd expect more. And it is because other diagnoses plummeted.
Right.
Particularly intellectual disability.
Yeah.
Well, and that's because it was, it's what's useful, And I tell the story in Nobody's Normal about my daughter Isabel giving a graduation speech. And she's giving this speech at her high school graduation. And when she starts to talk, you can hear that she's probably autistic, or she has a difference. The rhythm of her voice is different. The tone and the syntax is kind of sing-songy. And a lot of these people in the 3,000 seats at the Constitutional Hall in Washington, D.C. started to whisper. Some kids laughed. They murmured. Those laughs, those whispers, those murmurs, those are the sounds of stigma. And then she had a sentence where she said, people with autism like me. And all of a sudden it quieted down. Why? Because that word autism had become a non-stigmatized framework that all these kids and family members knew. And so what was inexplicable or enigmatic or even maybe weird or bizarre, strange, suddenly made sense. And so if we can have diagnostic terms that drive services, make sense to us, and are not harmful and hurtful, if we disarm them somehow, like we did with autism, then we can celebrate those terms. I don't see it as a problem.
Right. Well, you're speaking to someone through my advocacy effort at DBSA, we really believe very strongly that we should get away from trying to put people into neat, clean buckets and rather focus on the individual as a whole. And I think that comes out loud and clear, in your book, that let's start focusing on individuals as a whole rather than and working. So they have the opportunity to work with their clinicians and caregivers to get the treatment outcomes that they're seeking.
Right. And then, the problem is when those labels or those diagnostic terms come to define the person rather than drive a treatment.
Yeah.
Right. So, I go through in, some detail the origins of certain kinds of disease classifications, or I even talk about the invention of homosexuality.
Right.
And I'll just mention that a little bit because I think that it's illustrative for the general argument about how we create new terms that end up being stigmatized. The word homosexuality enters the Oxford English Dictionary in 1976, and it enters the English language in 1892. Now, that's not to say that before that time, there weren't men who loved men and women who loved women. But it was an act. It was a behavior. And I'm not saying that it wasn't stigmatized before or criminally prosecuted. When King Henry VIII passed his anti-buggery law in the early 16th century, it wasn't because, the person was a particular kind of individual branded for life. It was because of an act. And so what happens over the course of the Industrial Revolution is that we changed the evaluation of individual behaviors and acts into labels to brand a person as a whole. And it changes the way we think, it changes the way we behave. I've looked at old team athletic photos. It's really interesting. Before 1892, baseball teams or, basketball teams, other sports teams, they're all, hugging each other and touching each other all over the place. And then as homosexuality becomes a more popular word, they have their hands behind their backs and nobody's touching. Because without this branding of this kind of person, the homosexual, men were much more affectionate with each other.
Yeah.
The letters were certainly much more affectionate. If you read some of the letters that Abraham Lincoln wrote,
I was thinking of that. Yes.
they were passionate.
Yes.
Letters. If he was, in fact, having sexual relationships with another man, and he had a long-term relationship with a man named Joshua Speed, he certainly would have been afraid to have been found out. But he wouldn't have been afraid to be labeled a homosexual. And that's what stigma is. Yeah. Stigma is that the branding of the whole person as a kind of person.
Yeah, for many of us in the advocacy arena, and I'll focus on my role in advocacy, and so many of us, including myself, I will raise my hand on that. We cite stigma as a huge barrier to care. Yet you suggest in your book that stigma shouldn't be a conversation ender, right? So why is that?
Yeah, I mean, this is one reason I wrote the book, is that every time people complain, and rightly so, about people not getting enough treatment, about people being secretive, not disclosing when they need help, they say, oh, it's stigma. It must be stigma. As if, and then the conversation stops, right? Because you've explained it, I guess. But the problem is that if we just say, well, there must be stigma, we don't have then the opportunity to develop ways to understand how it arose and how to change it. Now, the sort of going line in a lot of advocacy communities is that stigma can be overcome with awareness and education. And I don't think that's worked. People are educated. People are aware. The American public, for example, knows a whole lot more about mental illness than ever before. But a lot of the stigma doesn't come from that. Stigma doesn't come from ignorance. It doesn't come from lack of awareness or education. Stigma comes from the society that we live in and the ideals of what we consider to be a good person and what we consider to be a meaningful life. And that has its roots. Just as, we talk a lot these days, in this last year or two, we've talked a lot about racism and institutionalized racism, that these ideas we have about race and immigration and ethnicity are deeply rooted in our history. And it's the same with stigma. And so it's not education or awareness that's going to eradicate stigma. It is changing the values that we have about who we consider to be a good person. Normal is really a variant of the good, and abnormal is a variant of what we consider to be the bad. And every society can find something to stigmatize, but they'll all stigmatize something different because they also have different values. Now, just because we see that something's rooted in our culture doesn't mean that it's there forever. In fact, identifying the cultural origins of stigma is a very empowering thing because it means we can change it. It's not in our nature. It's not in our genes to stigmatize others. It's what we teach to our children, and we can change what we teach. But we need to identify it and see it when it happens. And if we just say, oh, well, there's stigma, we don't understand the history, we're just going to keep going on in the same sort of, history repeating itself.
Right. That's very good. It's, speaking about history, I'm very curious on your insights. I know we're living through some very, very interesting times that I know history is going to look back on. I always say, you know, we know what it's like to live through history when we're living through the 2020s here. So thinking about COVID, and as you brought up, heightened awareness around racial inequities, what do you think 20 years, 20, 30 years from now, how are we going to look back on these times? And what do you think, what's your prediction on how we will have, how mental health will have changed and our views around mental health because of the interesting times?
Yeah. I wish I had a crystal ball, of course. I can tell you that that there are many examples during this pandemic of people who have suffered greatly. If we're just talking about people with pre-existing mental illnesses or developmental disabilities, the social isolation, anxiety, it's been pretty traumatic for a lot of people, and there are lots and lots of new onset mental illnesses. People who never had any, psychiatric diagnosis in the past, who during the pandemic are now getting diagnosed and looking for treatment. And psychiatrists are really in high demand, and it's hard to find people, let alone afford them. And there are all these insurance issues, of course, to deal with. But there are also some kind of positive things that we see. We see that many people with disabilities who advocated for remote work for decades now are finding that at least their managers are finding that people can do quite well working remotely, that their businesses won't necessarily bomb or their workers won't necessarily slack off. There are people who were socially awkward, like people with autism, who are finding that they're able to be more social because the kind of awkwardness of the Zoom platform and other remote platforms is a little bit of a leveler, leveling the playing field. We all none of us know when to interrupt and when to repeat ourselves and so on. And it's kind of awkward. And so we're all learning this together. And I think that 20 years from now, to get to your question, I think we will look back on this as a really innovative time, a time when we didn't just embrace technology, but we found that technology could be employed for purposes that we never imagined, like helping people with disabilities, helping people to do, teletherapy has been doing pretty well.
Yeah.
And if you went, if you go back 5 years ago, people are saying, oh no, we can't do, it won't work at all. So I think it will be seen as a really generative time in the same way that wars were. One of the things that we're doing in my department, and I'm a co-principal investigator on the study of grief and mourning during the pandemic. And we're looking at how people are adapting to social distancing when a loved one passes away. And it's quite remarkable what kinds of things are happening in the world. Not just individuals creating new forms of rituals, new ways of dealing with the loss of a loved one, but we're also seeing changes in the funeral industry, where the big companies who used to prey on vulnerable people to have the biggest funerals with the fanciest food and all the flowers are not preying on the vulnerable mourners of the recently deceased. And because you can't do that on Zoom, we're finding all kinds of changes going on. And so that's what we'll find 20 years from now. We'll say, oh, when did this happen? It was during the pandemic that we developed.
Right. Well, this has been fascinating, Richard. And I will share that just as a point of reference that I grew up in a funeral home, but in a small town in Ohio, but my dad was one of the biggest things that he did, I would say, is probably take care of the mental health of the grievers and the mourners in our community. It's been a fascinating conversation. I want to open it up to Eric to see if we have any questions from our participants.
Folks, we do not yet, but I'm sure we will. I'm going to ask a question though, but I would ask anyone who has a question to either raise your hand and we'll get to you, or pop it in the chat box. Appreciate it. In the book, you make a distinction or a discussion about the difference between mental health and mental illness. and some thoughts about that. I was wondering if you could expound on that a little bit more.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. I use the
I
word
know
mental.
you have a very firm. I know you have a very specific about the National Institute for Mental Illness. In fact, that's how that got named.
Well, it just is. It was notable to me that almost all the institutes are named for particular conditions, like alcohol and substance abuse, or neurological conditions, or stroke and cancer and whatever. But then we have the National Institute for Mental Health, and I think that mental health has been embraced as a euphemism because people are uncomfortable talking about illness, and I don't like the word disorder because it evokes all those pejorative terms that are, you've lost your mind, you're nuts, have a screw loose. Any of you in this audience will, I'm sure, be able to come up with some of these terms that all are a kind of gloss on disorganization or disorder. And so I just use mental illness. I think that part of the eradication of stigma is saying we're not going to let others beat around the bush. We're not going to let others define us. We are going to define ourselves by ourselves. And if we say, like people do in CRIP studies, they take CRIP, right? They take this word that had been used to stigmatize them and they own it. And they are going to use that for their advocacy. Or queer, or fat, or any of these other terms that have been used to punish and discipline. If we take those terms and we own them and we define them ourselves, then I think we can make great progress. And so I think just mental health is what we strive for, but mental illnesses are mental illnesses. They are a particular form of suffering that we all share. I mean, nobody's immune from mental illnesses and nobody's unconnected to mental illnesses in any way. I think where I find the most resistance to the word mental illness is when I refer to things like autism as a mental illness. And there's a lot of debate about that. Yes, it's a developmental disability, but it's also in the DSM, and the psychiatrist it's in the psychiatrist's domain. And I would rather also think of mental illnesses as illnesses, which for the social scientist means the experience, rather than disorder, which is what a pathologist or a diagnostician uses it. In anthropology, we talk about illness versus disease. Disease is what you see under a microscope. Illness is the way that human beings experience it, how that a particular condition motivates or mobilizes a certain social network, how it changes your future, how it changes your relationship with others, your view of yourself. Those are the things that aren't captured in the technician's lens. Those are the things that are captured when we look at a person's life.
We've actually gotten a few questions. So go ahead, Phyllis.
No, go ahead, Eric. I said I didn't know who you wanted to read the questions, whether it was.
You want me to read them?
I'll just read them out.
Okay.
Because I've had a couple have been sent to me directly also. First question is, good evening. Great insight and discourse. I know a stigma is a stigma. However, I'm an African-American woman with bipolar. It's been my experience that the African-American culture has a stigma of its own. When it comes to mental illness, my Caucasian friends have been much more accepting of me. What's your insight on this and how we can help the African-American community change their values to eliminate stigma?
Yeah, thank you so much, Kia, for the question. I think that if you look at advocacy and you look at media, you do find that there are people who would affirm what you're saying, that there have been great difficulties in eradicating the stigma of mental illness in African-American communities. But I think that one of the things that I point out in Nobody's Normal is that I think that psychiatry and psychology as disciplines actually contributed to the belief that mental illnesses should be something to be ashamed of in African-American communities. In the book, I describe how mental illnesses among African Americans have for at least a couple of centuries been associated with being Black, of being of African descent. There's a tremendous amount of racism in the history of psychiatry. In fact, one of the things I write about in Nobody's Normal is how slavery was actually supported by those who believed that slavery helped prevent mental illnesses among Blacks in the United States. There was even a disease name, a mental illness name, drapetomania. What was the symptom of drapetomania? The symptom was the desire to not be enslaved. It's remarkable, isn't it?
Wow.
So there is this, this history of oppression that is related to the way in which African Americans have been viewed by doctors. And the remarkable thing, I mean, even my grandfather was a very compassionate psychiatrist and psychoanalyst, but even my grandfather, his books were all about white people. And norms were developed by studying white people. When the W.T. Grant Foundation in the 1940s gave a huge amount of money to Harvard University to try to characterize the quote unquote normal American male, their entire sample of people in their study was Harvard students. I mean, so what becomes the norm is the Harvard student. So yeah, I could go on and on and on. These are huge issues.
Thank you. And it is an issue that within DBSA we're definitely beginning to address and try to understand. So we'll look forward to working with you on some of those issues. Question from Jake. Many associate bipolar with violent behavior, such as an active shooter, yet the stigma tag is not appropriate for most persons with this illness. Does this suggest the need for a new or renamed classification for bipolar, similar to autistic or Asperger's?
Could you reread the question, because I didn't hear a couple of words.
Oh, my apologies. Yeah. He says, we associate oftentimes bipolar with violent behavior, such as when there's an active shooter. Yet the stigma is not appropriate for most people. Does this suggest the need for a new or renamed classification for bipolar, similar to the way you talked about the autistic spectrum Asperger's situation?
Yeah. I'm actually an advocate of language change when it helps. And I give the example in the book of Japan, in which the renaming of the word schizophrenia from a Japanese word that really meant a mind torn asunder to a kind of integration disorder had a dramatic impact in the number of people who were able to seek treatment and actually hear a diagnosis, because the previous term had been just so devastating that even doctors who knew it was the appropriate diagnosis didn't want to ever utter the word. I think the issue of violence is really important too, because we know that people with mental illnesses are vulnerable to being victimized, to being the victims of crime far, far more often than they actually commit crimes. Having, no mental illness does not mean you're not going to be a criminal, and having a mental illness doesn't mean that you are. And what's more, I think we should be following the lead of some advocates to develop different numbers other than 911, so that people can be phoned or called upon to help somebody when they are having a mental health crisis, without, getting police involved.
I'm actually, that's a great segue for me to mention that we've been very active on the implementation of the new 988 number, which Congress approved last year, to address many of these issues. We're looking at it as an opportunity within the advocacy community to expand and really develop a better mental health crisis response system. And particularly, for instance, here in DC, it's been recognized that our mental health crisis response system in DC is very poor. But it also then addresses, how do we change the issues of police response and broadening the types of responses. So this is definitely an opportunity we're looking at right now.
Yeah, and I'll use this opportunity just for our DBSA family out there to to go to the DBSA website and look for our position papers, because we do have a position paper on stigma. We do have one on gun safety as well, that just because you have a mental health condition does not mean that you cannot be a safe user of gun. And basically it goes back to your the civil rights, that regardless of how one feels about the Second Amendment, why should people with mental health conditions be discriminated against with have the same rights as anybody else? And we also have a new position paper out there on police mental health training. So I encourage you all to go take a look at those position papers from DBSA.
Rand has said a question: did mental illness become a problem and thus a concept when the social supports in Europe broke down with the advent of the industrialization period, where the asylums then proposed as a solution for these problem persons? Asylum movement.
Yeah, asylums were developed for not specifically for people with mental illnesses. They were developed for people who were problematic, who didn't fit the mold, who didn't fit the ideal. Once the asylums had enough people in them, then for the first time, doctors and scientists could say, oh, well, we can carve out different categories. Now that we've got enough people here, we can see them all together. We can see we've got criminals, we've got paupers, we have people who hear voices, we have people who do this or that. And that is when you get the development of mental illness terms, as well as the prisons, because you didn't have prisons before that. Prisons were a kind of reform where people said, hey, why should all these other people be with the criminals? Let's put the criminals someplace else. And so the history of these institutions is really fascinating, because they couldn't have existed without numbers. And you didn't have these numbers until you had urbanization and until you had this ideal of individual productivity to a degree that made somebody who was dependent on others a problem, as you put it. And you're totally right in pointing out that a lot of the traditional kinship networks were dissolved, particularly as as there was consolidation of land ownership, and people couldn't continue to work their customary land. And when people moved to cities away from their relatives, you see in almost every place in the world that with urbanization, you get higher rates of isolation, loneliness, and then also mental illnesses in general.
That takes me back to my observation from the beginning of our conversation, Richard, where we're talking about societies where I use the word compassion and you use the word support, that they supported the members of their community. And, I think that we see that today with so much breakdown of the ability to support one another, that kinship that you talked about, and, and how that plays into the increase in mental illnesses.
Yeah, you always have to remember I'm an anthropologist. So I veer toward the social process rather than the individual feeling. So instead of compassion, I talk about social supports. Yeah.
Well, but we certainly also, the need for more social supports within the mental health system is crucial. So, Brooke has asked a question: from all the research you've done and read, what do you see as the biggest issue needing addressed in regard to mental illness? I'm going to expand on that just a bit and say you commented early on about the focus on brain research. We hear about that from many aspects of our scientific community, and you sort of had some questions about that. So that may be a separate question or maybe related to this, but I'd be interested in having you first. What do you see as the biggest issues being need to be addressed, and then also this focus on brain research?
Yeah, I mean, I can't. There's so many issues that are so important. It's really hard to. You can't rank them, but it's a great question, because I think that we have to talk about what we think are pressing issues. I think lack of treatment, lack of availability of good treatment is one of the major issues. I mean, if I'm today suffering and need to have mental health care, and even if I've got the money, even if I've got decent insurance, it's going to be hard. I'm going to make calls and everybody's going to have a message that says, I'm not taking any new patients at this time. I mean, it is hard to get care, let alone minimally adequate care. And the time also from distress to treatment, not just because of availability, but because of people telling you you don't need to see somebody, or can't you just talk to a friend? That also exacerbates conditions. You know, if you broke your leg today, you're probably going to go right away to an emergency room. But the first, from first psychosis to first mental health care visit in the United States is on average 74 weeks. That's a year and a half. Now, the other thing we have to understand is that mental illnesses themselves can negatively affect treatment availability. If you are depressed, you may think you don't deserve to be treated. You may not have that effort to be pounding the pavement and making calls to, because you're depressed. And we have to understand that people are not always going to be able to overcome some of the barriers that are actually inherent in their illness in order to get care. I also think that certain treatments are particularly stigmatized and yet can be lifesavers. And I have an entire chapter in Nobody's Normal about electroconvulsive therapy. And it's probably the most controversial or contentious, but I don't, maybe because that's why I don't get asked a lot about it in events I do. And because people maybe are uncomfortable talking about it, but it's a lifesaver. And I saw it save lives when I was in high school and I was working at a psychiatric hospital as a teenager because my grandfather wanted me to become a psychiatrist and he wanted to show me what there was. And when somebody has failed to improve after psychotherapy and medicines and other kinds of therapies, and they are at risk of dying, electroconvulsive therapy is something that can be a real game changer. And so I think that's, you know, that's another issue around the question of treatment. I know Eric did refer to my critique of the brain, and I think that that's a problem as well, that we have to understand our experiences in context, and that every survey I've seen on the neuropsychiatric turn has shown that the more that we think about a person as having a broken brain when they have a mental illness, the more likely people are to fear them, the more people are likely to stigmatize themselves, and that focus on the brain has not done anything to help stigma, or it hasn't done much to help stigma.
Thank you. I want to comment, Kia has thanked you for your insights, and she's so excited about what she heard that she forgot by your book. So I will say, Phyllis has a copy of the book right there. You can buy it at Politics and Prose. I'll put a plug for that there. That's where I bought my copy. So we like to support our local bookstores. To get it there.
Yeah, I should say, Eric, it's also available as an audiobook.
Oh, good.
And it's also available on Kindle. And then by the end of the year, it'll be available in 7 or 8 other languages as well.
So we've had a couple of other thank yous and comments. I'm going to now turn it, unless there's any last questions, got 15 seconds here, folks. I'm going to turn it over to Alvin to take us out and thank us all. But I want to add my personal thanks to you all. And I should note, but we will have this recording up on the DBSA NCA website by the weekend. So you feel free to let your friends and family know about this if you feel they would find it of interest. So, Alvin, do you have any final remarks for us?
Okay, well, I get the honor of giving the final thank you. Others have expressed in chat, shared by all, to our presenters tonight. The book by Roy Grinker is a great new edition. I hope we'll all get get to read it, and we appreciate you sharing your time and local resource we now know about, maybe sometime in-person speaker. And I'm also pleased that we got a chance to share the stage with Phyllis Foxworth. People should be aware of her work, and Eric works with her as the advocacy director for National DBSA. So I thank you both for this wonderful program this evening. And I thank all those who joined us. And, our support groups continue online on our website. Dr. Jacobson next month. Thank you again. Stay healthy.
Thank you, DBSA, for all the work you do.
Okay.
Thank you,
Good night,
Richard.
all.
Okay, take
Good night,
care.
all.